Hello, hello. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to start slowly as people move digitally from the waiting room to our main Zoom room. But welcome to this evening's Conversations in Contemporary Art. This is our second of the season, and we are doing it in a new format. We are in an open Zoom space rather than the mysterious construction of the webinar. So you can all see each other, and you can all see Matt, he can see you. I'm hoping that this is a convivial dynamic, but I do want to bring your attention to the fact that we are recording this session. So if you prefer to have your videos off, you're very welcome to, but what will be posted will only contain the video recording view of people who are speaking. So myself at the moment, Matt in due course, and if any of you wish to ask a question verbally, of which you're very welcome to do so, that will also appear on the recording. So I'd like to be very transparent about that. We all are recorded in so many constituencies already. But there are also many other ways where you can participate or be present without video. There is the space of the chat in Zoom, which is open such that you can message everybody else in the room. You can also message specifically myself and Matt as hosts of this meeting, or you can log questions and curiosities or things that you would like to discuss further in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of our Zoom screen. I will do my best to keep attention on all of the things. But at any point, of course, in the discussion period, feel free that you can also unmute yourselves and speak with voice. So with those logistics and sort of, I don't know, critical path out of the way, we can start with the social parts, which is introductions and getting settled in. I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces in the room, which is wonderful. It's so nice to be welcoming Matt Karras to the SICA platform. Some of you who might be repeated visitors to SICA would have been expecting the face and dulcet tones of Anna, the director of Fourth Space, to launch us off. Conversations in Contemporary Art is partnering with Fourth Space this year to do a sort of digital version of these gatherings. SICA, which is an annual platform that welcomes artists, as well as curators, scholars, writers, practitioners of many persuasions and hyphens, to talk about their practices, what they're thinking about, how they make work. During the COVID period, it's been an interesting pivot to this digital format. And in some ways, digital is very much part of the conversation we'll be having with Matt, how we translate material and embodied gestures and practices into the digital space. But I would like also to mention that even though we are gathering digitally, the infrastructure that allows us to do so is very much based on land. Land, of course, is something that is so central to considerations of ceramic practices, working with earth and minerals and matter. And we are gathering under the umbrella of a program that receives funding from Concordia University. The campus itself is located on unceded indigenous lands. It's the Ganyangahaga land, and Tiohtià:ke is the Ganyangeha term for Montreal, as it's also known. And the term Tiohtià:ke relates to the separating of waters on what makes Montreal an island. So whilst we are gathering digitally, speaking about digital methods to materials of land and earth, let's also think about the infrastructure that's supporting this conversation. Now, speaking of Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, I'm happy to introduce Matt, who is a Montrealer, correct, Matt?
Yeah, well, I'm from Laval, so
okay.
I think it still counts, though.
Expanded sense, yes. Yeah. Welcome. And it's so nice to be hosting you in this capacity. We joined the Department of Studio Arts around the same time, but we're always, I think, passing ships either on Zoom meetings or in what felt like kind of chaotic forms of translating whatever we were doing in our classrooms into digital emergency practice. So we've been like passing ships working in parallel, but now we can finally come together, and I can welcome you to talk more about your work, not only in the Department of Studio Arts as a ceramic artist, but also with XYZ, the fourth Biennale that is happening at the McClure Gallery. So I'm going to put some supportive information in the space of the chat for those of you to browse alongside not only Matt's practice, but his involvement in this Biennale as a ceramicist, but also hosting and facilitating the symposium that goes along with it. And in the planned event for this evening, Matt is going to talk about his interest in working around the intersections of digital processes and ceramics, and is going to share a demo video with us that guides us through what one of those processes looks like. And then there's going to be time at the end of our gathering for discussion, questions, and convivial chat. So please feel free to join me in welcoming Matt. Matt, I'm going to pass the microphone over to you, and I will link to XYZ and your artist website in the chat. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Maya. Thanks for that kind introduction. And yeah, we've got this XYZ Symposium going on right now. Actually, we've had a bunch of talks already, and we've got a couple more up. Well, next week we've got on Monday, Elisa Au. She's going to be giving a demonstration at 2 p.m. and Del Harrow, he's demonstrating on Tuesday at 11 a.m. And then on Friday next week, there's a panel discussion that we've got going on at 2 p.m. And so please join us for all of those. And I'm just going to reorganize my screen space here because I want to share some slides with you. So just bear with me a moment. And all right, so I think you should all be able to see my screen now, or see at least some images in there. And well, what I thought I would do with this talk is I've got this demonstration that I want to play a little bit later on. But before, what I thought I would do is kind of frame my own practice and give you sort of a condensed history of how I got to working with digital fabrication tools, but also show you some examples of some artifacts or ceramic objects that I didn't make, but that have always kind of resonated with me and point towards some aspects of ceramics that I've thought have been like really interesting. This is an image that I've shown a few times before. So if you've seen this before, forgive me, but this is two plates, a pair of plates that are at the British Museum. It's a curatorial gesture to put them together, and you should read what it says below. The plate to the left is a Chinese dish from the 9th century, but it was found in Iran. And the dish to the right is a dish from the 12th century that was made in Iran. And the thing that I think is so interesting about this is the story that the objects tell. They tell a story about trade because, well, the dish that was coming from China was traded first, and then an imitation of that, trying to kind of copy the profile of that plate. And the Iranian potters had not yet discovered the material that was so important to making porcelain, kaolin. And so they were trying to manufacture this facsimile of porcelain, but it didn't have the same kind of material durability. So you see the way that it ends up kind of looking almost like it's older. That's just because of the softness of the material and how it has endured time. So encapsulated in these two objects is a story, and I sort of love the way that ceramics can represent exchange between cultures this way. This is another example. This is an article from 2017 in the New Yorker. And I guess the thing that's important to know about this is that, so this article is about the magnetic field. And the thing to know about that's important to know about before talking about this is that when materials that have a lot of iron in them are heated to a high temperature, they become like susceptible to the magnetic field, so much that they sort of like record the strength of the magnetic field. And scientists have been using like lava at the bottom of the ocean to measure the magnetic field, but they couldn't really date the lava because, well, the carbon dating is not really all that accurate. But at a certain point, archaeologists figured out that pots, especially earthenware pots that have a lot of iron in them, behaved in a similar way. And there, the archaeologists had this correlating information of the ornament on the pots that could really specifically date when the thing was made and fired. And that moment of the firing, the iron in the clay would kind of behave similarly to the lava. It would kind of record the strength of the Earth's magnetic field. And I love that. I love the way that like the pots became these recording devices for this information. My teacher was a potter, and he sort of would say things like, pots are containers for cultural information. And I really loved that. And I love kind of seeing this example in that article from the New Yorker. So I encountered this too around this time when I was getting into ceramics. This is Diderot's Encyclopédie raisonnée des sciences. And here too, this kind of document initially was meant to behave kind of in that way, like a repertoire for all of the world's knowledge in one place. It was also sort of new that this document was representing mechanical arts. So for someone who worked in a discipline like ceramics and craft work, it resonated for me that this thing was displaying tools. And so I kind of loved it because of what it was talking about, but I also just really loved the drawings. And so I was like just dorking out on the drawings and enjoying that too. And at the time at school, my school had this whole collection of old Sears Roebuck catalogs. And there was something about the Sears Roebuck catalogs that to me sort of behaved kind of in a similar way to the encyclopedia, but it was a little bit more real. There was something about it that seemed like this was really the stuff that people consumed and wanted. And so I ended up thinking of a project that was kind of like that. Like I was trying to hand build things that were tools, but only using my hands. And in that moment, I was thinking about my hands and hand building like a rudimentary form of technology, and the mark that it left was important too. The fingerprint became sort of emblematic of that technology, or maybe like no technology of making something just with hands. And so I built up this kind of repertoire of all of these tools and was thinking of that in that kind of light, like these were representations of our culture and the way that human beings kind of like surround themselves with things. The title of the piece was called Users, which related to that, but also related to this kind of addiction that we had to objects, or that I feel like human beings have to objects. And so at this time, this is around maybe 2008 or 2007, I kept hand building in this mode, making functional objects, or rather objects that looked functional or that were sculptural objects about function. But it really sort of ebbed and flowed between like really specific types of things. Like over here, there's this like Franklin stove, or here there's a lampshade for a lamp, and here's this sandwich or a ladder. And then there were things that were really kind of abstract, like this form. I didn't know quite what it was, but it was also sort of in the mix of things that I was making. And I made things that I was really kind of consuming every day, things that I was eating. Like here, there's a piece of broccoli, a little wedge of brie, 2 Twix bars, and some juicy fruit gum. And I amassed this kind of big grouping of things. And so I started playing with them and making kind of like a timeline of consumption. This is a piece called In a Day. And maybe an important thing in this image is like these markers over here of these dinner plates, because they really mark like breakfast. Over here, there's lunch, and back here, there's another one that's for dinner. And everything that I did in a day, I would sort of position it in that order in this big pile of things. And so there are things in here that are really kind of specific. And then there are really abstract things that maybe just kind of represent movement and represent things that were a little bit more difficult to make an image of. And then in a really kind of practical sense, these coils that are kind of generating some sense of movement in the piece, they also help prop the piece up and kind of lift it up off of the ground. So I was interested in functional things. I was interested in like making things by hand and thinking about how I made things that had like a relationship to how the thing would get read later on too. Like there was meaning embedded in just making things by hand. And so this is sort of slowly phasing into the digital fabrication work, because I want to talk a little bit about that effect of the mark of making things. These are two pots from Biot in France. Biot is a small town in the south of France, and they make pots in the strangest way over there. They make pots like this. They basically will cut profiles out of wood, and all of those profiles are sort of held together by one central stick over here. And around the profiles, the potter would wrap a piece of rope, and then clay is thrown around the rope. So it's used sort of like a casting device. And then when the clay is stiff enough, the pole in the middle comes out, the profiles come out, and then the rope comes out, and the pot is done. And obviously, I mean, the potters have left this beautiful mark of the rope in the middle there because, well, I think anybody that makes things maybe has this relationship where you see something that happens in the studio and you think it's sort of beautiful. And I mean, it's just absolutely gorgeous to me to see that remnant of the mark in there. And so when I first started getting interested in digital fabrication, it was related to this curiosity about how we make things and the effect that making things has on the surface, and also the way that pots and ceramics have been able to record the way that things are made and represent it later on. This is an example of a CNC milling machine, and this is one of the plates that I've made that you can see in the show at the Visual Arts Center. It's got all of these marks on it that are a direct artifact from the CNC milling machine, moving back and forth and cutting through the material that I then used to make the mold to make this plate. So I'm really kind of interested in not hiding that stuff, but figuring out ways that it could become a part of the piece, similar to how I was making decisions about hand building and leaving all of the marks from my fingerprints in the piece. The other thing that's related to this digital fabrication work is just the sheer availability of forms that the internet sort of brings us. Like the Victoria and Albert Museum has a huge part of their collection available digitally. The Met Museum, these museums around the world have all of this stuff that we can explore. And so for me, that ends up being a real kind of gift that you can just peruse these galleries and be inspired by this work and see things that you otherwise would not have seen in your local museum. So I end up using a lot of this stuff as source material, and then I'll bring it into a computer program called Rhino. And from there, I use the images that I find to generate working models, and then use those to make ceramics. And so the demo that I have prepared for you today is about that process, about using Rhino to kind of source an image, and using Rhino to generate a model from a source image in there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll play a video that I've recorded here of this demonstration. It first starts off in the Rhino space, and then it goes over to the ceramic space. And I guess the one thing to say is that Rhino, I think, is just like the coolest CAD program out there. It's so fun to use, and so I hope you all get to try it. So, okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then head over here to the video. Just one moment. For this demo, I'm going to be using this image that I found off of the Met's website. It's an image of a plate that's a part of their collection, a German plate. And so I'm downloading each point of view that they have. This is a public domain image. And using these images, I'll be able to build a working 3D model. Once I've downloaded the image, I'm opening up Rhino and adjusting the units in my file. This is something you could set to whatever you prefer, but I'm setting it to inches. The first command I'm going to use is picture. It allows me to bring in an image, so I'm going to bring in the image that I downloaded of the plate. In Rhino, you can just start typing a command and it'll pop up. You can either use the menu or the toolbox, but I like just typing commands and it's a lot quicker that way. So once I've dragged the image onto the building plane, I can set the transparency of the image lower so it helps me see the grid below and sometimes can be helpful. Next, I'm going to zoom in on the plate so that I can line up the center of the plate with the center of the grid. Once the plate is centered, I'm going to use the polygon tool to draw a 9-sided polygon on top of the plate image. This plate's got 9 lobes on it, so that's why I picked a 9-sided polygon. Just realized that grid snap was on, so I switched it off in the middle of the command, which is possible to do in Rhino, so I can get the polygon lined up a little bit more exactly. It's not perfect, but it's good enough. Next, I'm going to use the arc tool, and I'm setting it so that the arc's start and end points are how the arc is defined. And I'm going to use the polygon I just drew as a guide. Favorite keyboard shortcuts in Rhino is the spacebar, which basically just repeats the command you just did. So I'm using that to continue the arc command across the entire polygon. Next, I'm going to join all of these arcs together to form one continuous curve. So I'm typing in the command join and then selecting each of the curves. Next, I'm going to draw the inner profile of the dish. So I've used the polygon tool and set it to 9 sides. I'm starting from the center, and I'm going to use both this inner profile and the outer lobed profile to loft my dish. So here I'm selecting the outer profile and I'm going to move it upwards. This is going to define the elevation of the dish. The lobes on this dish have a curved edge, so I'm going to select the center point on all of those curves and move those even higher. That's going to help me define the curved edge. Next, I need to define the cross-section profile of the dish, so I'm starting by drawing a straight line from the inner profile to the outer lobed profile. Here I'm adding a few control points, that way I can curve the profile. Next, I'm going to use the sweep to rail command to loft the surface of the plate using the inner polygon profile and the outer lobed profile. I like setting the perspective viewport to either shaded or rendered. It helps me understand exactly what's going on with the form. Next, I need to build up the volume on the outside of the profile, because that still needs to continue and form a straight edge that will be the top edge of my material later on. So I'm offsetting the initial polygon that I drew, and I'm going to move that upward so it's a little bit higher than the highest point on the surface of the dish. Then I'm going to draw a cross-section curve that extends from the outer profile to that offset polygon, and I'm going to sweep that one as well. Next, I'm using the patch command to define the base of the plate. And finally, I'm going to use the Boolean union command to join all of these surfaces together. I don't really need my source image anymore, so I'm going to select it and change it to a different layer and then hide that layer. Now that I've got my surface defined, I'm going to use the Boolean split function to duplicate it in reverse. So here I'm extruding a polygon using the outer perimeter, and then I'm going to select that polygon and use the previously made surface as a cutting tool to cut against the extruded polygon. The result will be two surfaces, the reverse of what I just drew and what I just drew. The result is the surface that I'll be sending to the CNC milling machine. So the machine is going to mill this surface out of wood or foam, and that's what I'll be pouring plaster into. Once the tool path is made, it could be sent to a CNC milling machine. Here's a CNC milling machine that is milling or cutting into high density foam. So once that cutting is done, what you could expect to find is something kind of like this. These are two examples of different profiles that were milled out of high density foam. So typically I would wrap a caudal around these forms and pour plaster into them. Let that plaster set, and from there I've got a working press mold. Here I'm making a clay slab. The press mold works by draping a clay slab on top of it, so I'm going to use a rolling pin to evenly press out this slab. I'm rotating the clay slab so that all the clay particles are evenly pressed in all directions. Pressing the slab this way helps keep the plate from warping later on. Here I'm using two sticks as spacer guides so that my slab is the same thickness the whole way through. Here I'm compressing the clay. This is what makes the form strong and prevents it from warping later on. Clay particles behave best when they're well compressed. Here I'm using a wooden tool to cut the edge of the clay off. I don't want to use a metal tool here because I don't want to scratch up my plaster mold. Here I'm checking for little bits of plaster. I don't want those to get into my recycled clay. Once the back side of the plate is defined, I'm going to use a fork to score the back end of the plate where I'm going to attach a foot. The foot is going to allow the plate to sit off the surface of the table. Here I'm adding a little bit of water to the area that I scored, and it's going to help me build up a little clay slurry in situ. That's going to act as a mortar that I can use to stick the foot onto the back of the plate. Here I'm making a coil. I'm starting by wedging a little bit of clay. I'm going to slowly press this out into a coil and use that to build my foot. Here I'm scoring one side of the coil so that I can attach it to the back side of the plate. Once the foot is attached, I let it sit on the mold for about 30 minutes or so. It depends on how humid it is outside and how wet the mold is. Then I need to remove the dish, so I'll blow some air between the mold and the dish, and that should help release it. Here I'm using a wooden stick to help define the thickness of the rim of the plate. I don't want to cut the rim too short, and I want to stay consistent through the entire dish, so this tool is helping me do that. Once the edge of the dish is marked up, I'm using a piece of floss as a wire cutter to cut the edge of the dish. So I'm going to slowly rotate it and follow the line I drew. And finally, I'm compressing the edge of the dish. This is going to help keep the edge strong and prevent it from cracking. All right, well, that's how you make a dish. And looking at that, it kind of made me realize, I mean, I think I already knew this, but I really try to work with as rudimentary of the tools on the back side of the plate, and the front side of the plate gets like the digital fabrication stuff. And I like that mixture of those two elements intertwined. It's something that I think really kind of, I guess in a way it ends up activating the objects for me. Some other things that I do to the forms in Rhino is I often will end up warping the forms a little bit out of shape. And there's something about that that reminds me of, well, the plasticity of the clay itself, but also the way a lot of these ceramic objects get used. They're like really in motion, handing dishes to people over a dinner table, or like just the way kitchens are such active places. And I guess I always felt I felt sort of jealous of art forms where there's a lot of movement or sound. Like ceramics is such a still and kind of stagnant thing sometimes, that there's something about that sense of movement that I think is, it sort of solves for that. So here are a couple of examples of dishes that were made in that way. These are about 3 feet long. And some of these were also fired in a wood kiln. And that's another way that I like kind of mixing things up. I like kind of, yeah, finding old forms of technology and then mixing them in with this new form of technology. And so, yeah, so these dishes here were fired in a wood kiln. And a wood kiln, similar to like other kilns, they get hot. But the thing that a wood kiln does is it gets hot through burning wood. And when you burn wood, you get ashes. And in a wood kiln, the ashes fall onto the ceramic. And the kiln can get so hot that the ashes themselves melt and form a glaze over the piece. And it's a really beautiful glaze that both sort of shows the detail on the piece itself, but also reveals the process by which the piece was fired. This is one of the kilns that I fired that in. This is in Denmark at the Guligo Ceramic Research Center. This is a Buri box wood kiln, a train style wood kiln. The person who really helped kind of think through these kilns was a potter named John Neely. And you see the flame coming out of the top of the kiln. The way that these are organized is basically the fuel, the wood is over here. There's a system of grates that's holding the wood in place up above. And the flame comes down over to here. This is the main chamber of the kiln where the wares are. So this kiln was also kind of perfect for those long platters because they really fit well into the kiln. And then the gases kind of escape over there. And here's another set of dishes that I made that has one of these wood ash glazes, but it's a fake wood ash glaze where instead of actually firing it in a wood kiln, I formulated a glaze that is made to kind of look like a glaze that would come out of wood firing. And here's one last image of the work that's in the show at the Visual Arts Center in Westmount. And thank you all very much. I think probably have some time for questions if anybody wants to talk about process stuff or content stuff. I'm happy to talk about any of it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matt. I joked in the chat, but was very serious. I wasn't ready for the demo to be over. I could have done it for a long time. But thank you so much. And by way of bridging into some of the questions and discussion as we shift phases, I wonder if I can ask you something. Sure. And it's more of a question to ask, I don't know, a curiosity. As I was listening to you talk about your earlier works and how you're interested in, indexing and tools and almost maybe a way of like archiving consumption. You built up language around like things that you were preoccupied with and gestures. You talked a lot about gestures. And then in the Rhino video, the language of like that software is very particular. And it was, I mean, as I was listening to it, I was writing down the words that I was unfamiliar with as like things that do work on an image. Like you mentioned a Boolean function and the patch tool and extruding something. And I'm being completely naive and saying I don't know much about how RhinoCAD works as an interface. But I'm wondering if that's also a sensitivity or something that you're curious about, of like the language of the methods and the gestures we use to explain something and how that changes as we are working with different tools and interfaces, like something like RhinoCAD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess, well, one of the things that that I appreciate about it is just the way that it seems to be built up of tools that I kind of recognize from the ceramic studio, like lofting something, or I mean, those are also kind of boat building techniques in there.
Yeah.
But those become a little bit more kind of it's easy to hybridize them in a way and to blend them together. The possibilities that could come out of that versus what could come out of like a material process are quite different. Like you can stretch things out way more than the clay would allow to in the program. But also, I guess, just having a plan view, like if you click on the menu and you see all that set of options there, like it's a little bit maybe like going to the library and you're looking for something there, but then there's a book right next to the book that you were going to get, and it's got something you had no idea you were going to be interested in, but you pull it out anyways. And so there's something about that, the possibility of maybe misunderstanding, of accidents, that those are also part of like working with ceramics too. Like there's a moment in these in the process of working with Rhino where you click or you hit enter and the thing executes, it's the kind of process executes, and then you see what happened, and it's like opening up the kiln and seeing what is in there too. There's also, it feels so kind of performative, like even sometimes there could be a little mistake, like two planes aren't touching, and then it doesn't work for some reason, and it's because of some glitch in the process, and you could start over again and then it'll work, or I mean, I'm not an expert at Rhino either. Like I'm kind of like a ceramics guy or potter that has learned how to use Rhino. So I know I probably don't draw the things efficiently in there. There's probably a bunch of just mistakes that I end up making. But yeah, I guess I'm sort of interested in the way that those kind of mistakes can happen and as a method of form finding too. So I don't know, I feel like I'm rambling a little bit now. I hope that answers your question, but if it doesn't,
yeah, no, not at all. I mean, the question was rambling in itself because I was just curious about, I don't know, moving across the interfaces and how that might change the language and gesture of work. Because, you know, when you're working with a material, you always develop a certain kind of vocabulary of how you talk about what you're doing. But
yeah.
it struck me like the software language was really poetic. And yeah, there's definitely also something to be said about like the curiosity of not knowing how a program should work, because then you find fun collisions like you were describing. It can be a nice magical moment.
There have been moments where I'm in the studio and I make a mistake and then my brain goes, oh, edit, undo. And then I realize I can't do that now. Like there's this
Right.
concrete reality of something there that yeah, it works a little better in the other direction.
Yeah,
But
yeah, for sure. There's some great questions coming into the chat, Matt. So let's turn our attention to those. Feel free to keep them coming. But also, I forgot to mention, if you want to indicate that you want to bring voice to your question, just feel free to use the raise hand function or physically wave because we can see you. If you're not sure where that button is, there's an option at the bottom of your Zoom windows that says reactions. It's a little smiley face. The raise your hand function is just under there. So do feel free to let us know. Otherwise, I'm happy to pick them out and read. Okay, so there's a question here from Mylène. Hi, Mylène. I'm going to read it out loud because I don't have a cue from you. So thank you so much for your question. When I look at your work in the XYZ exhibition, I think of the idea of manual work that is done on a computer keyboard and with the digital equipment. Is it a dexterity of the hand which is quite different and just as important as for the use of traditional tools, but which is not easily seen on ceramics? We can, however, imagine it. On the other hand, I find it interesting that the physical trace of your hand on the back of your works is present but invisible for the viewer, which also leads us to imagine it and consequently to make a different reading of what handmade means in relation to digital technology.
Yeah,
well,
and it's not a question, it's more of a comment. And also when I look at your demonstration, I have to say that it's totally magical for me, because when I looked at your work, I was trying to figure out how it was done and I had it totally wrong. Like to see you work, like and to see all the time you spend on the clay too. Yeah, I just imagine it like different way, but I like how on the front, like when you look at the plates, you see the technology, and I think of the keyboards and all the manipulation, and on the back there's your hand manipulation. I just like that invisibility of the hand, like on the computer and on the clay, like yeah.
Well, thank you. I mean, a lot of these things too, they just end up happening through the process of making it. And it's not like I thought about, I did not think of it as a composition to begin with, that there would be handwork on the back, digital work on the front. It was mainly because I use press molds, and I know that with a press mold, if it's a hump mold like the one I was using, you get a clean inside of the plate and the fingerprints are on the back, and it ends up being kind of a little bit easier to serve on, or a little bit kind of crisper that way. And then the afterthoughts, for me anyways, they start coming in, and then I like look at it and start composing based off of that. And I guess I was also like, to begin with, kind of cautious about the digital work, because I felt like there was so much magic stuff that happens in the way different people articulate with a tool or play an instrument, or like one person plays the guitar, somebody else plays the guitar, and it really has a different energy to it, or a different kind of reverberation, and digital tools seem to like take that away. But now I guess I've just grown to love them because they're a tool like any other. You can have a lot of fun compositionally with them, and the hand stuff actually doesn't go away. You could still have a ton of that present within it. And the other thing I've kind of fallen in love with the Rhino stuff is figuring out like a clever workflow for coming up with forms, because certain forms have different ways that they might best be built. And sometimes it doesn't come that clearly to me at first. Like, I don't know exactly how to approach it, but I'll think about it. And there's like some specific way that it like wants to be built almost. And that reminds me of making too. Like that reminds me of work in the studio as well. So I don't know, I see all of these different crossovers. I mean, even thinking of like the potter's wheel, the oldest method of making is the mold. And like the oldest molds really were our bodies too, like pressing clay on your elbow and using that as the beginning of a pinch pot. That predates the wheel by like a really long time. And then the wheel comes, and even when the wheel shows up, it was the sort of wheel like I was using in the demo, a tournette, like doesn't have a flywheel on it. It just spins when you hit it, and then it slowly kind of slows down. The flywheel was this other piece of technology that came like 1,000 years after the tournette. And so, I don't know, thinking about those things puts into perspective the fact that these technologies are still, I don't know, they really do, I think, kind of belong in there. Yeah. Thank you for that comment, Milen.
There's a related question about sort of the textures that you've been talking about with the digital and the potential for that process by, I'm going out of order to try and make this thematic. So I'm not going to miss anyone. Isabelle asks a question about links between your work and new materialism, and also thanks you for your generosity. I suppose there's maybe a triangular, like we could triangulate that to not only new materialism, but thinking about like the digital affordances and language. Isabelle, your hand is up if you want to say anything further.
No, sorry, I just don't know how the tool works. So you can go ahead, Matt. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I guess I do. I think of it as like there's something about our availability of images that influences what we end up making, and the types of tools that we have at our disposal that influences the kind of things that we can end up making. Like the wheel ends up being a tool about making radially symmetrical objects. And so there's some sort of like casting that sort of comes out of the tool itself. So yeah, I think about it as a mode of vocabulary, and part of my interest in engaging with it has to do with that. Like picking up an electric guitar instead of an acoustic guitar in the 60s or something. Like it just seems like this is the instrument to play with now. And so I think hopefully I've answered your question, but let me know if there's something I haven't answered in there.
No, I think it's pretty interesting. I was thinking about your piece that is made from iron, and that kind of being transformed by the magnetic field of the earth. So it's kind of you kind of try to show an external force. So that was the link that I've made with the new materialism, and I was wondering if there was something else. Or
Well, how about we switch from new materialism to historical materialism with Linda's question. Linda, thanks you for the demo mentioned. It's fantastic. I'm curious how you come to source the forms in historical forms as opposed to inventing a form, and how do you want us to recognize and account for those links?
Well, I end up referring to them. Well, the first thing I guess that I'd say is that working in ceramics, a lot of the forms that we're playing around with, I mean, it's hard to invent something in ceramics. Almost so many things have been done already before in a discipline that spans like thousands of years. So I'm kind of conscious of the fact that a lot of the time as a ceramic artist, we're engaging with stuff that's been there before. So I guess like the way that I end up talking about it is sort of subtly in the context of describing the pieces or naming them or titling them. And yeah, and some of the times I guess it grows to be quite ambiguous. Like I've warped it so much out of shape that it might no longer become recognizable as coming from the Derby factory, and then it becomes maybe a little bit less important. And a lot of the times I think the surfaces that I end up using end up being reflections of a process rather than emblems from a specific culture or time. And so there's some, I guess, ambiguity in terms of where stuff is coming from. And maybe I take like a little bit of a step back in terms of being really specific about it. So yeah, I guess I'd answer it in that way. Yeah, just sort of conscious, of the fact that ceramics is made up of so many like precedents as a part of it.
There's a similar couple of questions related to not necessarily the historical material and source material, but of the different iterations you create along the way and whether or not you reuse molds. This is a question from Colin, but also Helam. And the relationship, I'm reading now specifically from Helam's question, between the ready-made and the original. So a similar curiosity to Linda, perhaps. But goes on to ask, I wonder how you define your finished work. I think conceptually, they seem to be an original, unique work of a ready-made object, the plate. Do you have this concept in mind when you create your work?
So I guess, I think I make pots about pots. I mean, that's like one part of it. I don't think I'm a production potter or like a potter. I don't make amounts of pottery that would like warrant that. I'm more interested in creating variations of forms, but it's to me, it's like, it's pottery about pottery. And yeah. And maybe it goes back to that thing that maybe I'm continually grabbing onto what my teacher had said, like pottery is a container of cultural information, and looking at variables of that, of like using the pottery information as the surface content in some way, or the process itself as the surface information.
In that sense, Matt, I will have a nerdy curatorial question, which is the installation of some of your works. I was reacting a lot to seeing your earlier pieces about the tools, like the user ones of the tools on the floor, and they looked quite sort of sad, or maybe they were sleeping. I don't know. There's something about their isolation on the floor. In contrast to you doing the installation work at XYZ and the Visual Arts Center on the wall, and for me, that is a very specific curatorial gesture of a pot made for a pot, to have it on the wall. It invites a very particular kind of attention and bodily relationship to something. Like, we're not to touch it and pass it, or maybe necessarily use it as a vessel for food. So I wonder if that is also a decision you're making in consultation with the curator. Like, the installation of the work seems also important in its framing.
Yeah, well, I guess there's a bit of a backstory to it, which is that my grandmother's sister worked in a porcelain factory in Germany, in Tirschenreuth in Germany. And every Christmas there'd be like this box of goodies that came. And a lot of the time, I think my grandmother would get like seconds or things like little plates that had a little flaw on it from her sister. And so on the wall was this, in the dining room, a big display of these blue and white plates. And so I guess like in the thing that's going on in my mind is like, I'm going to set it up like my grandmother's plates in there, because I think that is the antithesis of digital fabrication in some way, or like that's one mode of playing around with that. Then I set it up that way and I really wasn't happy with it. There was something about it that wasn't dynamic enough. So I set it in a sense of disorder, and I showed it to the curator, and I think it was okay, but it took a little while until it got like, until they agreed to it, and it was all right. And I had to change things up a little bit. Anyway, so some of it is just coming from my own personal history and looking back at that and trying to figure out installations that relate to it. It's also a really traditional way of showing pottery on the wall like that. And I'm kind of, and some of those dishes are being held with kind of plate holders. I also have these like plate holders that put things on the table, put dishes on the table, really like a kind of a knickknack would be. And I like, I guess, the tension between those things. There's a side of it that looks like a knickknack, but it's also like this sculpture that I'm thinking about in that way. So some of it has to do, I'd say, with, for me anyways, that was my kind of thought process. It's also just a great way to look at them. They become kind of like paintings that way. And so I like dealing with the pots and that. And you can sort of formally see them, like the profiles a lot easier that way. And there's something dynamic about the way those long platters, they almost look sort of like they're melting on the wall. And there's something I kind of like about it. So I usually end up making a lot of those decisions. It's sort of a back and forth between how I'm thinking about it and then how it looks. And oftentimes it ends up being that the how it looks part is the more important one for me. And the how I'm thinking about it is a little bit of the gas or the driving force. But if it doesn't pass the how it looks part, then I won't do it. Or that's when I really question my idea. It's like I trust how it looks more than how I think about it. So yeah.
Renee, I see that you have your hand raised. Feel free to ask away.
Oh, thank you. Hi, thanks for the demo. I was wondering, like this, now that you have this process that you're like comfortable with the pots, like taking a picture, making the model in 3D and then making the mold, like, you know, bringing it to life with clay, are you interested in applying the same process to different objects, or kind of, you know, like starting from that and then like broadening?
Yeah, I mean, I would be. There's a resonance to them being pots that, to me, I mean, maybe that is where it's, to me, it's clear, like this isn't just about pottery or just about function. It's about the resonance between the pottery objects themselves and the process. So there's something I like about those. But yeah, there's so many other ways. Probably will happen in the studio while I'm making something that, it would be so good to have this little tool. I could just draw this tool out, print it, and make it now. So I could see it happening that way, probably more so. But what I want to do next is fill a whole wall up with different profiles of plates. And so I have a lot more plates that I want to make before I think I'm going to jump out of the plate. The other thing that I've made using this process are tiles too. I mean, the different kind of tessellating patterns, and those end up being just really easy to work through digitally. And so there's a lot of just even visualizing things, like wondering, you know, like when you sketch something out and there's something that happens then when it's made manifest as an image, that it's like thinking out loud or saying something out loud. And there's something about working digitally, maybe not even to fabricate anything, but just to think through things, that I think ends up being kind of really useful. So yeah, I guess long way of answering it. I totally could see making other things in there, but for now, I think I'm having so much fun just playing with pottery forms and using it for making tools in the shop too.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
The art historian in me really appreciated how you framed the talk, starting off with 12th century, migration of a plate that there was still, trying to tinker around the technology of making it, and then how that can manifest in the 21st century, that this is in fact a way of making that's centuries old, but has different complexities and ways of thinking through. And that's a lead into a question from Maria, who I think, oh yeah, she's still here. It's a question about consumption and economy. Maria writes, "Hello, Matt. Loved your presentation. Thank you for showing us your work and your process. Lately, I've been talking a lot with my friends about the fact that almost all our social events or leisure time are related to consumption. Even if we meet for a walk or just see each other, it's very common that we end the day drinking a beer or having dinner at a bar. I kept thinking about all of this when looking at your work, homemade, 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 home, and the reflection about the function of the objects that were part of these social events, even when the event is over and people have left the space. I'm also very interested in relating the idea of consumption to the handmade product through the material, porcelain in this case. I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit more about this work."
About the work in the homemade home project?
Yes,
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, that was a project I think that stemmed out of that In a Day project there, where I was really concerned about all of the things that I was consuming through the day myself. It felt like it was a never-ending thing. But obviously, we need to eat, we need to, live, and there's some degree of consumption that's woven into, and I think maybe how we do that gracefully is kind of the question in there. But that project, the Homemade Home project, was about sort of realizing that even the handmade was being commodified. Like that, I think I'd gone to Crate and Barrel. There was a set of dishes there that had like fingerprints cast into this dish, and I looked at it and I was like, those aren't real fingerprints, or if they are, those have been mass produced. You're selling the idea of this thing, and it wasn't. There's something that made me question this idea that it seems like everything ends up being kind of co-opted by the other side and gets turned in on itself. And there was something sort of depressing about that. So that exhibit was about like this moment at the end of the dinner party when everything is being consumed, and then what do you do at that point? You still have to kind of find some method of enjoyment at that point, and maybe it has absolutely nothing to do with consuming. Maybe it's something else that is about making us happy. And for me anyways, it's actually like, I love making things and I love kind of working with material. And so in some ways, I guess it is a mode of consumption. I don't think I've solved the problem in myself at all. But that, that was the thinking a little bit around that exhibit in there, and also those In a Day projects. And because they were also sort of captivating images, but in the end, they were piles of stuff. There's like a 14-foot long pile of things that looked from far away like it looked like garbage. And I don't know, I think, but when you got closer to it, then you would see that like what the things were there, and there's a little bit more of a story there too. So anyway, so I don't know that I'm answering your question fully.
Yes, you are.
Okay.
Yes, you are. Thank you.
You're welcome.
There are two linked questions, Matt, related to technology of sort of. There's a question from Camille. Camille Charbonneau, thank you so much for that fascinating demo. I would be interested to hear your opinion on labor in art and how technology influences it. And I'm going to link that to a question from Marianne Chenard that has a kind of like specific desire for that idea of technology and labor. Thank you, Matt. A great demo and talk. When you alter the form, I see it as exposing or talking about the glitch, this error that can become a force for change. To quote Legacy Russell in Glitch Feminism, great text, nice reference. A glitch is normally thought of as an error, a faulty overlaying, but liberation can be found within the fissures between gender, technology, and the body. The glitch offers an opportunity for us to perform and transform ourselves in an infinite variety of identities. What is your opinion on glitch and art? How do you see the transformation of these historical forms going forward in your work?
Gosh, I don't know how to answer that. Well, I'll start with that. I'll attempt to answer it, and then I'll talk about the labor portion. I guess, like, I think of the glitch, maybe I'm misunderstanding the question there, but I mean, I feel this about myself all the time. Like, I feel nervous. I'm easily nervous about things. I'm nervous about this talk. I'm nervous about making a mistake. But then again, there's a part of me that knows that, like, the mistakes often end up being the most interesting parts. And that happens also, like, with the pottery too. Like, you maybe work really hard towards getting something right, then a little flaw happens, and that ends up being the thing that you really like about the pot. Or maybe even like practicing an instrument, and you practice something over and over and over again, and it gets so perfect that there's something at the end that becomes kind of flat-footed about it, and it no longer is interesting anymore. And so, like, I've been interested as a maker around that tension. Like, how do you keep doing something and retain some freshness to it and not have it become flat-footed or boring? And the glitch ends up being a really kind of useful device for that to me. Like, the accident that you didn't expect to have happen that surprises you is the kind of saving grace in the studio. So that's, I think, how I'd answer that. And then the first part of the question about labor and technology, I guess the thing I think about is like that essay about from Adolf Loos, An Ornament and Crime, and the way that he, like, sort of talks about the way that the toil over kind of decorative cuts and all of that work, and why put the worker through that process in there. And I guess I'm, interested in how all of that ends up becoming machine made, and it's no longer at all kind of an issue. Personally, I think that work, like, okay, watching the demo at a certain point, I was like, I don't know if I can play this thing. It's kind of boring. Like, it's just me clicking through all these processes. But then there is something that I find really meditative about that work. And to me, labor in the studio ends up kind of doing that too. I cannot wait to get there so I can glaze this piece for 3 hours or carve something really slowly. There's something I love about that work. And so, I guess I didn't agree with Ornament and Crime to begin with. Like, I love ornament, and I think that workers also, I mean, it depends who is doing that work, obviously. But in the situation of studio art work, I think that is the stuff that, like, potters love kind of doing that sort of work, or that's why we do it. So I don't know, there is some tension there, and I think it does something in terms of taking away the part of the fastidiousness of that work. And yeah, so there is some political kind of component to that gesture there. I don't think that my work necessarily is about it. I think there are other artists that make work that kind of maybe draw out that tension more clearly, but I think it's a really interesting question. And I hope that answers it. I don't know if it doesn't, please carry on and pose it again in a different way, or whatever you like.
I like your framing of the glitch, Matt, being a potential for creative renewal or of staying fresh. I'm gonna carry that for the rest of my Zoom operations in life, where glitch is not necessarily something to be feared, but we can reframe it as an invitation to be excited about something.
Yeah, the glitch comes off differently at a dinner party than it does on a piece of pottery.
Yeah, suppose that's true. I'm curious about, I mean, you were just talking about loose and the ornament and crime. I mean, I'm not going to ask you about that text specifically, but use it maybe as a jumping off point to talk about the range of movements and expressions of opinion there have been in the history of ceramic arts and pottery, and how that also intersects with design history and art history. And that ornament and crime text is very much like, this is the right way to make things, and was aligned with modernism and all sorts of, like, a very particular reading of the body and efficiency and aesthetic. And you yourself, Matt, have taught for a number of years. Before Concordia, you were at the Maryland Institute College of Art, MICA. And I'm curious, I don't want to ask about what you've noticed changing from a student perspective or pedagogical interests, and instead ask the question other way around, which is what do you find to be a continuity of like teaching and learning and clay over your years of teaching?
The desire for technique and how to do things like that has not gone away. I think everybody wants to know how to use material, how to use tools, and get good at it. And it doesn't matter what the tools are, but that seems to be a common thread. I guess then in terms of the digital tools, it's funny, but I guess the programs are so specific that it's such specialized knowledge that even though I think a generation is brought up with computers, it doesn't necessarily mean that like Rhino is going to come easily, or some of these really specific programs will kind of come easily. It's too big of a leap, I think, from instant messenger to that, or from, like, that's not a good example at all. But I think you get, yeah, right. So, but yeah, I think like the continuity is that people are curious about, I think they want kind of useful content, either historical stuff or like, I'm not a historian, but I'm interested in that stuff, and I like pointing to what I'm interested into, with the caveat that like, hey, I'm not a historian, but look at this. And so students have always been interested in that, I think. Though I have gotten the comment that like the lectures are a little bit too long. So maybe I've talked too much about some of those things. But yeah, technique and just wanting to know how to make stuff, that has been the most kind of continuous thing in there, I think.
We have time for maybe one more question. We've got about 5 minutes left. Are there any latent curiosities in the room? Or Matt, do you have a question for the assembled folks? I ask you that in sort of calling out a comment that's come up in conversations in contemporary art as a seminar, because sometimes there's a class that's attached to this lecture series, as you may know, Matt, but some folks in the room might not know. And sometimes we meet as a closed seminar, and sometimes we meet in a capacity like this, which is open. And we've been talking a lot about how we can glitch the artist talk. Maybe I'm going to use that suggestion from Marianne to think about the glitch as a creative gesture of invitation. And some people have talked about the reflection, like, well, what if the guest was allowed to ask us questions, or flip the table on what the Q&A does? So you're welcome to, if you fancy.
I'm thinking about it, though. I have to admit, the part of me that wants to make everything perfect is trying to think of the perfect question, and that's preventing me from thinking of a question. I would sooner say, come to the demos next week and see Elisa Au's work. Elisa is from Vancouver originally and currently teaching in Texas, and really makes unbelievable work. And Elisa and I we went to undergraduate school together, and then we were in graduate school together. We sort of just ended up following each other, and she's really fantastic. And then on Tuesday, Del Harrow, who's really highly skilled at making molds using Rhino. So Del will basically just he won't make the model. he'll make what's called a case mold, the mold that makes the molds in Rhino, so that all he has to do is like pour plaster into those things and get working molds out of it with registration keys and everything. Yeah, gosh, I mean, I do want to know what you all think about the work. That's the thing that maybe I want, but I feel like that's not a fair question to ask. And maybe I'll do it over tea individually with people when we cross each other in the hallways when we're finally back on campus.
Absolutely. And I'm realizing as the host, I was a bit unfair in saying like, well, why don't I just see if this works without telling you in advance?
No, it's okay.
So very deftly navigated in passing the mic to the other folks involved in XYZ. But also I like the democracy of this being like an iteration of your engagement with the folks who are in the room and also interested in working with ceramics and digital fabrication, to have other conversations along the line. So yeah, nice closing. I don't think I can top that.
Yeah. Thank you, Maya.
I've put the link to XYZ again in the chat, so please feel free to check that out. It's open until the 23rd of October, and as Matt mentioned, there's continued demos over the course of the week. So at this point, I'm going to invite everyone to join me in thanking Matt for the generosity of your talk and the demo and the candor of the conversation. That was a really nice discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining in. It's nice to see all of your faces.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to also say a background thanks to Alexandre, who is the tech, who's not had much to do because we're all just getting into the talk about practice, but thank you, Alexandre. And I also want to send a thank you out to the MFA program who sponsors these SICA talks. So great. Thank you so much, Matt, and good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.